Good morning, ladies. Um, I am just excited about today's lesson because I haven't taught this story from the Old Testament in probably 20 years. And it's one I like, but I'm seeing it today in a new light. You know, the Old Testament culture where women were considered property is just kind of amazing how God ended up showing his amazing love and honor to quite a few of those female characters in the stories. We would think of Esther, as being one that God honored, and that she was just so revered and still is to this day. And others, Sarah, and so we know that God does honor women, especially in Bible days. They were just considered property. And so we can rest assured as women that God will honor us also. We see today, in today's glimpse of Jesus in the Old Testament, a representation or a foreshadowing of Jesus in the character Abigail in this story in 1 Samuel 25. God portrays these Old Testament heroes for his own purposes. They're flawed humans, and they're just like us. They are not to be held up as perfect examples of how to be a godly follower of Jesus. But even more than that, we are to learn from their mistakes rather than their successes. We've been learning that God wants us to see a larger meaning behind the stories. He wants to see the massive picture of redemption and making all things new through these stories. It's not just a history book. It isn't even just a morality book. It is about the big picture of making all things new. So we're going to begin in 1 Samuel. And I'm going to be reading large chunks of the passage, and you are welcome to follow along in your own Bible. But it's 1 Samuel 25, and I'll read 1 through 13 to begin. Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his home in Ramah. Then David moved down into the desert of Paran. Now just let me quickly set the stage for you. Samuel the prophet, who had anointed David to become king, had passed away, but the previous chapter tells us that King Saul, the current and the first king of Israel, was out to take David's life. And David had the perfect opportunity in chapter 24 to take Saul's life instead. And out of a great sense of duty and honor, he had that opportunity and he turned it down and would not lay a hand against the Lord's anointed. And so he has now moved from where he was hiding in that cave down into the desert of Paran. Now, moving on in verse 2, a certain man in Maon who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats, 3,000 sheep, and he was shearing them in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband was surly and mean in his dealings. He was a Calebite. While David was in the wilderness, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, "Go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. Say to him, 'Long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours. Now I hear that it is sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them, and the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they will tell you. Therefore be favorable to my men, since we have come at a festive time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them.' When David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name, and then they waited. Nabal answered David's servants, 'Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse?' Many servants are breaking away from their masters this day. Why should I take my bread and water and meat I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where?" David's men turned around and went back. When they arrived, they reported every word. David said to his men, "Each of you, strap on your sword." So they did, and David strapped his own as well. About 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. Now, ladies, I just want to make sure you get the picture here of what's going on. We have a very wealthy man and his beautiful and intelligent wife, a huge property owner in that area where David and his mighty men had been hanging out. Now, they're fleeing Saul, so they are trying to stay below the radar. But in their time in the wilderness and in the deserts, they ran across these shepherds who were caring for the sheep of Nabal. And while they were around, they protected the shepherds from any kind of bandits, from bears or wolves or any kind of predator that would steal the sheep and kill them. And so they had done a great service to Nabal. So the other significant thing is that at the point that David is requesting the food supplies, it's sheep shearing time, and that time of the year is very, very festive. The people are in a very hospitable mood. It's a time of celebration, and so it would not be out of character or an alarming or scary thing to have these men show up and request food. They had earned it because they had been so helpful, as we're going to find out that was confirmed by the shepherds themselves. But it's also just a time of hospitality, and so it was a reasonable request from David. But the response from Nabal, this surly and mean man, is very harsh. To question who is this David, who is this son of Jesse, is pretty ridiculous, because everybody knew who David was. There was no way he didn't know who David was. There had been so many celebrations of David's successes. Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands. Everybody knew who David was. He had killed Goliath, for goodness sakes, as a young teenage boy. And so for him to question the identity of David is very ridiculous, and it's very demeaning for him to react this way towards David. And so in response to Nabal's brusque nature, David is ready to take up a sword. He is ready to take 400 men, and he intends to wipe out not just Nabal, but everyone in his family, his servants, the shepherds, everybody that is even closely associated in any way with David. With Nabal. And so we see a really bad situation brewing. But what I want us to look for from this point on in the story is how Abigail is a foreshadowing of redemption. How she is a fabulous Old Testament picture of the redemption story and what redemption looks like person to person. And similar in nature to Joseph's story that we looked at in the last two lessons, we'll see that Abigail represents a lot of the characteristics of Jesus Christ. She isn't, we're not in any way saying that she is Jesus, or she is on his plane or his level. Not in any way. We're just saying that certain characteristics in this story are foreshadowing Jesus. So let's continue reading as these things will be starting to come up here in just a minute. Starting at verse 14. One of the servants told Abigail, Nabal's wife, David sent messengers from the wilderness to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us, and the whole time we were out in the fields near them, nothing was missing. Night and day they were a wall around us the whole time we were herding our sheep near them. Now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him. Abigail acted quickly. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. Then she told her servants, "Go on ahead, I'll follow you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal. One quick comment, unrelated to the foreshadowing of Jesus, is just that I taught this story, 20 years ago maybe, and I tried to make it a lesson on marriage and some of the hard things that men and women, husbands and wives go through. And you just have a hard time making this fit a biblical understanding of husbands and wives and submission. It doesn't fit a particular philosophy of marriage. And so it was one of those frustrations in my tenure as a teacher to not have everything just fall into place and like a puzzle fit together nicely and be a picture of marriage. And I learned something through that, is that God does not intend us to always measure or interpret these stories of these people in some kind of neat, perfect package. Sometimes he has, as I said in the beginning, a greater story that he wants to tell. And this story is this intervention of Abigail into the disaster that was about to take place, just as the disaster of sin in this fallen world was intercepted by Jesus Christ. In the same way, Abigail is about to do that. So let's look for those things. Verse 20 says, as she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there were David and his men descending toward her, and she met them. David had just said to his men, "It's been useless, all my watching over this fellow's property in the wilderness so that nothing of his was missing. He has paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, or may God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him." So we see she came riding on a donkey. Obviously, we see such parallels there to Jesus. We know that John 12:14 and 15 says, Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it, as it is written, "Do not be afraid, daughter of Zion. See, your king is coming, seated on a donkey." That's a quotation in John from Zechariah 9, verse 9. So we see a picture, a foreshadowing of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem on a donkey. And here we have Abigail riding on a donkey as she encounters the future king of Israel. Now in 23 through 31, we see these words. When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed down before David with her face to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "Pardon your servant, my lord, and let me speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. Please pay no attention, my lord, to what this wicked man Nabal has said. He is just like his name. His name means folly, and folly goes with him. And as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my Lord sent. And now, my Lord, as surely as the Lord your God lives and as you live, since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, may your enemies and all who are intent on harming my Lord be like Nabal. And let this gift, which your servant has brought to my Lord, be given to the men who follow you. Please forgive your servant's presumption. The Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my Lord, because you fight the Lord's battles, and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my Lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away from the pocket of a sling. When the Lord has fulfilled for my Lord every good thing he promised concerning him and has appointed him ruler over Israel, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. And when the Lord your God has brought my Lord success, remember your servant. There's a lot of incredible beauty in this declaration that Abigail makes here in 28 through 31 that is almost like prophetic of the life of Jesus. In this section, I'm not saying anything about a foreshadowing of Jesus in Abigail's life, but what she says is, to David, who is a forerunner of Jesus Christ, is really like making declarations, not just to David, but making declarations about Jesus Christ and his rule and reign. But I want to point out that when she arrives in front of David, she says, "Pardon your servant, my Lord. Please pay no attention to what this man has done." She is begging for the sins of her own husband to be placed on her, which is just amazing. She says that she is his servant. And now, Lord, as surely as the Lord your God lives and as you live, since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, may your enemies and all who are intent on harming my Lord be like Nabal, be like fools, but let it all fall on me. So it is an amazing declaration that she makes here. She was willing to bear the guilt of Nabal's sins. Isaiah 53:11 says, he, speaking of Jesus Christ, he shall bear their iniquities. And so this is what Abigail is willing to do. She is willing to bear the guilt of Nabal's iniquities or sins. We also see in that passage that Abigail's actions saved a foolish man. I mean, she's clearly identifying her husband as a foolish man. His name, Nabal, means foolishness. And so we see in Jeremiah 4:22, where God says, "My people are foolish because they have not known me." He's even speaking of his own people, Israel. And he says, they don't really know me. And by not knowing me, they are fools. And we know from 1 Corinthians 1, Paul says of the Corinthians and of just people in general who resist the gospel message that they are foolish. So it is quite a powerful action that Abigail is making here to save a foolish man. Another thing we see is that she is providing an offering for the sins of another. We read earlier the kinds of things in verses 18 and the list of things that she took to offer a peace offering to King David. This 200 loaves of bread, this 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs. my goodness, what a Costco closet she had. And all of this was ready to present to David. She's acting with haste as she does this, provides and offers this offering for the sins of another person. And isn't that exactly what we see in Jesus Christ? That he provided an offering, the offering of his very own body. Ephesians 5:2 says, "And walk in love as Christ also has loved us and given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma." His offering was his body. So again, another picture we see here of Jesus Christ through the story of Abigail. Moving on to verses 32 through 35. David said to Abigail, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak." Then David accepted from her hand what she had brought to him and said, "Go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request." So Abigail was able to turn away the wrath of David. He was full of wrath. He admits it. He says, "You have kept me from avenging myself with my own hands." Here's a little thing that that just jumped out at me even after I had prepared the lesson. He was trying to provide salvation with his own hands. Isn't that interesting? There's one of the translations, and I don't remember which one it was, as in my preparation looking at the parallel passages, I saw the word salvation, where he said, "You have kept me from bloodshed this day and from providing salvation with my own hands." Isn't that interesting that we can see from our understanding of the New Testament that we aren't able to provide salvation by our own hands? We can't provide that for ourselves. Only Jesus can provide that. But the main point I wanted you to see is that Abigail turned away the wrath of David. In the same way, Jesus turned away the wrath of God. His wrath against sin and against sinners was so powerful that because of his own holy nature, sinless nature, complete perfection, he could not look on sin, and it caused wrath in him to destroy all people. There's a passage, I want to say it maybe is Genesis 6, where God saw that there was only sin in the world, and that he desired to just wipe everybody out. His wrath against sin is real. And Jesus stepped forward and took the wrath and satisfied the wrath. 1 Thessalonians 5:9 says, "For God did not appoint us to wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ." That is the only thing that turns away God's wrath. Jesus' death on the cross is the only thing that turns it away. And so we don't receive the wrath of God only because of Jesus. And then we also see in that same passage that I read in 32 through 35 of 1 Samuel, David accepted from her hand what she had brought him and said, "Go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request." So he granted peace. He sent her away. He established peace. It's so beautiful, too, to me to see that David accepted from her hand what she had brought him. That's what we are to do. We're to just simply accept from God's hand this offer of salvation. We can't work for it. We must accept it from his hand. Now, moving on to the next section, the last section, 35 to 42. When Abigail went to Nabal, he was in the house holding a banquet like that of a king. He was in very high spirits and very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until daybreak. Then in the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things, and his heart failed him, and he became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Praise be the Lord, who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He has kept his servant from doing wrong, and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head." Then David sent word to Abigail, asking her to become his wife. His servants went to Carmel and said to Abigail, "David has sent us to you to take you to become his wife." She bowed down with her face to the ground and said, "I am your servant, and am ready to serve and wash the feet of my Lord's servants." Abigail quickly got on a donkey and, attended by her 5 female servants, went with David's messengers and became his wife. So, here we have this the highest level of drama right here in 36 through 38. We see that Abigail's actions actually won the day in her own marriage. She actually defeated the devil, just as Jesus defeated the devil on the cross. Now, this is difficult to see in most translations. You would have to go to the King James to see it. But in the King James, when it tells us in 36 that in verse 25, you have to skip back to verse 25 to see this in the King James Version. In this description of Nabal, she says to David, "Please pay no attention, my lord, to that wicked man Nabal." The word wicked there in verse 25, that description by Abigail of Nabal, in the King James is the word Belial. And I'm sure I'm not saying that right. Beliya space and then an accent AL. Now, that is a word in the Hebrew. It can mean the wickedness, but in the New Testament, it is used to describe the devil. And so here we have Abigail's actions defeating Nabal, who is also, his name can mean the devil, which I just find that an entirely remarkable picture of what Christ accomplished on the cross. We have a very, very important passage for us from Colossians 2:15. "Having disarmed principalities and powers, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it," that is, the cross. The principalities and powers, that's referring to Satan and all of his minions. And what Jesus did on a cross was to defeat and disarm the principalities and powers of the devil. He made a public spectacle of them. He triumphed over them at the cross, which was the fulfillment of Genesis 3:15, where the prophecy was given to Adam and Eve about the serpent, saying this Jesus, the seed of Eve, the seed of woman, Jesus will, the serpent will bruise the heel of Jesus, but Jesus will crush the head of the serpent, being the devil. And so we see here this picture of Abigail defeating Nabal, who is representative of the devil. The other thing we see there in that passage is that two things. She's willing to wash the feet of the servants as she is making her statement about the invitation or the proposal for marriage. She's willing to wash their feet, but also that she's elevated to a position of honor. We know that Jesus washed the feet. According to John 13:5, then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. But we also see that Abigail is elevated to a position of honor, just as Jesus, after defeating Satan, was elevated to a position of honor. We could look at so many verses about that. Hebrews 8:1 says that Jesus is seated at the right hand of the throne of majesty in heaven. We could remember the passage from Philippians 2 that we used last week in the story of Joseph's elevation to the place of honor in the kingdom of Egypt. We use that passage as a picture of the elevation of Jesus in Philippians 2, where it says he, of course, like Joseph, was in a place of complete misery and suffering, like Joseph was in the prison, and like Jesus was as he was brought to the earth to live the life of a mere human being. The Son of God then was lifted up to a name that is higher than every other name, and was raised to a point of every knee bowing and every tongue confessing that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So many pictures here in the story that is in Scripture for a purpose. And the purpose is bigger than just trying to figure out what this says about men and women and their personalities. We could go on that for days. But I don't think that's what God intended here. I think he intended for us to see Jesus and to see redemption, to see salvation, to see the forgiveness of sins provided by that act of submission, that act of surrendering our own agendas and accepting from the hand of God his offer of salvation. Keep on looking for Jesus in the Old Testament. With every story, you see Jesus Christ represented. So as you continue to love the stories of the Old Testament, do them with a new goal of seeing how many times you get a glimpse of Jesus.